Well, it's funny to do this without Margaret here, isn't it? It's really strange. Thank you for inviting me yet again. And I'm sorry I wasn't here this morning. It conflicts with, I'm a trustee of the Philadelphia Association, and it conflicted with the AGM. And on the other hand, I hear I missed a sort of staggering show, so I would probably be feeling even less good about bringing you down in my talk than I am at the moment. So it's great to see this new stuff coming in, and that's one of the things that's happening. We're diversifying a bit. So before I get onto my topic, I'm just going to update you with what's been happening in the boarding school survivors field. So, I think the first thing, we run our 4th intake of the Making of Them training, which is our specialist postgraduate training for counsellors and therapists who want to work with ex-boarders. And we're not doing one next year because I'm trying to run a couple work training next year. And we hope to do another on Making Them in 2005. But this year, after all the sort of separation that we had over the pandemic, we had a graduation with 10 people graduating, and it was absolutely brilliant. So it was a very proud moment for everybody. The other things that have been going on is that we've had an invitation from people in Canada to bring our modified form of the workshops over there, which is nice. We've got some quite unusual artistic projects on the fringes. John and Rachel's writing project. Are they here? Are they here in the room? Have you seen them, John? Yeah. Really new and creative way of working with the whole boarding school experience, which is great. And the other thing, really a bit of a game changer for me, is I did a day's consultancy in a ex-boarding school, sort of a public school, which used to be a boarding school, on helping their staff think about how they would approach what's going on for them at the moment, which is like many retrospective abuse cases. And as you may know, the CPS take this sort of thing seriously now. And so it was quite weird going into this old boarding school. And I took Kate. Is Kate here? Kate not here? One of our trainees from I think the 2nd or 3rd intake, who works at school. She sat beside me whilst we addressed this group of people who are now known as a sort of pastoral team and the safeguarding officer and all this sort of stuff. And they had me teaching them while they were kind of looking in their laptops and things to see what safeguarding issues are happening at this very moment. It was a very odd experience, but it felt, what pleased me, it felt like there was a headmaster there who had been aboard himself and was interested in the work and really wanted to think about his school as being a child-friendly environment going forward. So anyway, it's a first. I don't expect them to be many more of those, but it shows how the work is starting to come into the culture. I mean, it's slow, you know. I designed the first course in 1989, and we started running the workshops in 1990. They've been going continuously since then. And so we're starting to get these words like my boarding school survivors and Joy's boarding. Joy here? Are you here? Joy? Yeah, Joy's boarding school syndrome. You know, they're getting into the language now. People starting to get this. So things are changing, if slowly. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about was about something quite difficult to talk about. It's about the violence in British culture. And it's kind of ironic at this time with everything that's going on. But I planned this some months ago, and I was in the kitchen listening to the radio, doing the washing up. And there's this story came out, and I started to, my tears come rolling down my face. This. So it's a story of a young man who was born in Antigua, called Kelso Cochrane, whose life was cut short when he was attacked and murdered by a gang of white youths in Notting Hill, while he was just on his way home. This is 1959. And no one was ever convicted of this. And he wasn't living anything, he was just being. And you know, this is many years before Stephen Lawrence, which in a way is the same thing again. And you know, his family and people from his part of the world, from the Caribbean, had all been invited here to come and help run London transport, basically, when there was a shortage of manpower after the war. And so even though they came with a heritage of slavery, I can remember as a young child a little bit of what that meant, because I remember in what I call my sort of paradise years before going to boarding school, being about 6, on the streets in Ealing, and a couple of big kids came up to me. I suppose they were probably about 12 or something, and they come up to me, and I knew it was trouble. They come up to me and they said to me, right in my face, "Hey, you, rock and roll or calypso?" And I thought, I really didn't know what either of them were particularly. But I liked the sound of the word calypso. So I said calypso, and they said, "You're all right." And danger passed. And then when I go back to that music, what I see, there's just so much joy in it. And here's these people bringing all this joy in. So, and we didn't quite get it. And it's always difficult integrating difference, and so there was kind of a lot of violence. And, you know, my father used to talk about, my father came from Hackney, and sort of, you know, getting me to boarding school was like a big thing for him. And he said that his elders had told him, in the period that he grew up, the time between the wars, he said that the adults said that was an unusual period of stability and safety and lack of violence on the streets. Victorian London, as we know, is very violent. And, you know, the violence any time had the potential of coming back. And so a lot of the violence that we note comes from the bottom of society. And I don't think that's a complete picture, because, as you know, anyone who followed my writings, I have a sort of mad hypothesis that there is a connection between the sort of violent behavior that we take for normal in Britain. I mean, I don't know if you ever go abroad and come back, the first thing you notice that our streets are totally filthy, and everywhere else isn't. Yeah, especially if you go to Europe anyway. Yeah, the amount of violence that's in the bottom of the society, potentially there. My mad thesis was always to think that it has to do with something that the elites are disowning in themselves, and sort of by some kind of psychotransfusion ends up certainly in the underclass, but in the bottom of the society. There's some transfer from the bottom to the top that happens. And so that the topic that we are met here to discover, to discuss today, is not disconnected from this fight. In fact, it may well have a causal connection. That if you do this kind of violence to the children of your society, then the elite children of your society, that there's a kind of train in motion that gets set. It has to come up somewhere. It can't just completely, even though it's normalized, it can't completely underground. And then, some years ago, and I think in his first paper, Simon is here? Yeah, Simon wrote this fantastic phrase about at the threshold in the prep school, a terrible violence is done to our children, an emotional violence. And at the time when he wrote that, I didn't realize how important that was. I mean, it's really important, that level of violence that's done to the children. So now, we look at the sort of current mess we're in today, in this awful, heartbreaking situation in the Middle East. And we see that the architects of this whole setup there, we've got Lord Balfour, prep school in Eden. We've got, people know about Mark Sykes, for the Sykes-Picot Agreement, prep school and Beaumont. Yeah, these are people who had violence done to them as children, and in exchange get what I call in wounded leaders to be part of the entitlement illusion. And what I say in wounded leaders is the only way that I can really get a grip on that is that the entitlement is a compensation for irredeemable loss. So, there's more of a story, there's Sykes and General Allenby, I didn't check his school, but, I'm making a guess it's Harrow or something like that. Yeah. Callously betrayed the Arabs who'd been fighting alongside my old schoolboy hero, Lawrence of Arabia. If you've never read his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, I recommend it to you. It's a fantastic piece of work. Who kind of devoted his life to trying to reunite these different factions to drive the Turks out of the Middle East, and were promised this, that, and the other, and were completely, absolutely betrayed without any feelings. Of course, then, I go back to my own thesis about that, and what I've been trying to say about being a wounded leader is that if you're taught at a very young age, having had this violence, and the violence, we could say, that's the separation from your parents and the attachment crisis, the rupture, and the placing in an institution, and then not being allowed to show the feelings about it, then your whole relationship with vulnerability is fundamentally altered, both internally and externally. So how could they understand the vulnerable? How could they understand that betrayal wasn't, what is naturally and normally done? And then we're still doing it. I mean, look, remember the end of Brexit. There's this fantastic level of betrayal, even amongst their own, that happened. It's just kind of normalized along with the rest of it. So, one of the things I suggested last time I spoke is that because of this education, this training, Britain has been leading the world in dissociation from vulnerability. I don't mean only the Brits do it. No, there's much to I really don't mean that, because vulnerability is an existential issue. We all have to come to terms with our own vulnerability. But the Brits have kind of led the world in a way at training people to disown it from very early on, so it becomes second nature. And actually, if you go back again to the topic, that is a way of permitting levels of violence to people who are either socially vulnerable, ethnically vulnerable, but even they're the children of the elite. So, and the more that you permit this sort of thing, the more that you make it into a culture. And if you don't have an emotional, a ready emotional connection to your own vulnerability, you can't really have much of a conscience. So all kinds of things in the whole colonial project, like the exploitation of the earth, the exploitation of the natives in the places where we went, we take for granted. So, in 2023, I don't know about you, but I would want my leaders to begin to address those kind of things now. Because after all, we've had more than 100 years of psychotherapy. Yeah? But what do we see? We have Rishi Sunak standing on the stage, just like another head boy, like Blair did. Yeah? And apparently violence is okay. So the issue is these people can't do it because of the training. The training is very, very successful. That's the problem. And it's not just in them, it's also, all of us who have been boarding school survivors have gone along with the repression, the suppression, the control of the vulnerable elements in ourselves and often in our partners. And, I've just found Simon's quote. At the prep school threshold, a terrible violence disguised by privilege is done to children and parents ordained by a powerful and unquestionable establishment. Yeah? So, during this year, I had a lot more sort of contact with boarders because I did one sort of podcast where they managed to have my email address on it. And I had one guy, right, to say, not so much of the survivors, he said 25% of the year that he attended didn't make it. I mean, this is quite incredible. And the more you delve into this, you see how many things are part of our national life over years. I mean, I can think of the way they used to recruit for the Navy, for example. And there's a very good book by the late food critic A.A. Gill, who was married to Amber Rudd, Conservative minister, now seen as a bit of a wet, although in her day she was a little bit scary. Called The Angry Island. I recommend that to you as well. It's quite interesting. So, listen to the news, and the news is full of violence, isn't it? And one of the ways we always deal with this, human beings always, we always kind of organize an us and them around it, and a good and bad around it. This is a very simple sort of structural issue in the mind. So that if you know who is the bad one, you then have a kind of a psychic logic about who's the not bad one. And of course this applies at a level of politics, but it also applies quite a lot to us as ex-boarders, especially in our intimate relationships, because quite a lot of us might marry someone who looks like the vulnerable one, or the a bit chaotic one, or the messy one. And that even though we might be identified with being a victim of this violence to ourselves at our own boarding, we still do this kind of thing. And because that helps us feel like we are not the incapable one, not the incompetent one, not the vulnerable one. That's just how the mind works with identity. And so, because whether we know it or not, this training which has been so successful has made us, as it were, declare war on what elsewhere I called the inner indigenous. You know, so that there's a sort of unmade savage one in us whom we find hard to accept. And so that being then cut off from our emotions, we can be quite cold in our behaviours, in our intimate relationships. And until we start to really acknowledge that, for me, thinking psychologically, you can't end that kind of war, the war on the inner indigenous, until we start acknowledging how we end up sort of doing this kind of violence. And you could say, if we, the more we have a habit of treating parts of ourselves or someone we're in a close relationship with in a cold or violent way. I mean, when I say cold, and when I link violent, there are studies in the United States that people who have suffered, it's mainly from women who have suffered very absenteeing husbands, withdrawing husbands, experience that withdrawal as actually as a level of emotional violence. And until we stop doing it, recognize we're doing it and stop doing it, we're never going to end that war. And in fact, I mean, it's hard to get this, but you know, every time, there's a thing for us as, you know, boarding school survivors, every time we end up doing that, you could say, symbolically, you send your child back to school, back into that culture, into that world. So powerless as we are in relation to the sort of violence on the greater and the political scale, there is something that we can do about our own internal emotional violence to ourselves and sending ourselves over that threshold again, and or doing a sort of knock-on projection into our relationships. And then the paradox, of course, is when we really get that not being afraid of our own vulnerability gives us tremendous strength. This tremendous paradox. And I think then, you know, when we really get that and in greater numbers, then we're on the sort of royal road for creating a much healthier society. That's it.